I spend $70,000 a year on childcare right now. I sit in a
Yeah.
place of privilege to be able to do that. Huge conversation going on about the falling birth rates. But if people cannot afford childcare, they cannot afford to have children.
And this is Paige Connell, a working mom of 4 who shares relatable content on TikTok and Instagram, focusing on the challenges of balancing motherhood, careers, and relationships. Known for her candid insights on the mental load and advocating for equity at home and work, Paige's content resonates with millions. She also champions affordable childcare, paid leave, and reproductive rights.
Economists point to as a huge market failure. We need this. This is infrastructure. This is not a want. This is a need. And in a society where we are told these are your children, figure it out, it can feel very difficult with that narrative of you need to afford kids before you have them. All of these things, right? It feels impossible. And
Thank you so much for joining me today, Paige.
thanks for having me.
I am so excited to connect. I also am very excited, like that origin story of how I met you, of like seeing your face everywhere. Who is this girl? Finally meeting you in person, following you along, and now we're connected. So we met in person, and now I get to talk to you on the show. And you are becoming a leading voice in highlighting the childcare crisis in the United States. But this started with your own personal story. So can you share what pushed you to speak out and start using your platform for advocacy and the content that you provide?
Sure. So I was a mom creator. I started my content with no real intention to build any specific kind of page or policy, advocacy, any of that. I
Yeah.
started just as a mom sharing my experience. And I remember I stitched a video where somebody from Canada said how much they were paying for childcare. And she asked, "How much are you paying?" And I just answered. I just said, this is how much my family's paying for childcare. And I think I broke down the costs. I said, daycare costs this much, a nanny costs this much. And I just kind of shared what we were going through. And it went viral. And the response was wild. I was not expecting it in any way, but it really kind of jump started this conversation because I think at the time, this was almost 2 years ago, nobody was being super transparent about how much they were paying for childcare
Yeah.
because so often I think we're told, similar to like our salaries, we don't talk about that, right? We don't
Mhm.
ask people how much their mortgage is. We don't ask them how much they pay for childcare. That's private. That's their problem, not yours. And so, in saying it out loud, I think so many families and mothers in particular resonated. They said, "Oh my gosh, us too. How are we supposed to afford this? How can we have more kids? I was going to have a second and I can't afford it." And it just started this conversation. And I have a unique perspective because I have not only obviously experienced childcare from a parent's perspective, but I've also worked in daycares. I worked in
Mm.
daycares for about 6 years. I was a nanny. And so I have been both a childcare provider, but also a parent on the other side of the crisis.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that you had the experience from the other side. I knew obviously from your being a mom and having your children. So at the time that this video went viral, how many of your kids were needing childcare costs because they weren't in school yet or public school?
Sure. So my oldest was in kindergarten at the
Hmm.
time. My youngest three needed childcare. And so we had a variety of different childcare situations happening because I gave birth during the pandemic twice
Yeah.
in 2020 and
Ooh.
2022. And so because of that, there was a lack of childcare. As we know, the pandemic really created a situation where we saw the cracks in the infrastructure that is childcare. And childcare centers were closing, they were limiting their hours, they were losing teachers, closing classrooms, all of these things. And so I was unable to get my youngest two children into childcare until each of them were 2 years old.
Yeah.
So at the time I had posted that video, I believe my third child had just started or was about to just start childcare. And my baby was still at home. We had a part time nanny. And that was the only really way we could make it work. I was lucky to work from home. And so I had a part time nanny who would come just for a few hours a day. And then I would keep my fingers crossed for a good nap and work. And my husband was home at 3. And so we just really kind of were juggling childcare ourselves until we were able to get her in when she was 2 years old. I will also say, common misconception, childcare ends when kids enter public school age or kindergarten. If you're in a dual income home like we are, or even a single parent home and you need childcare, um, we have to utilize after school care, summer
Yes.
camp, all of these things that are also quite expensive and often left out of the conversation. But I find that so many parents are super prepared, for the high cost of daycare. They are not adequately prepared for the high cost of childcare when their kids exit daycare and the complexities that come with that. And so that was something I also started sharing as I was going through this experience because I think many people just don't quite understand or have all of the information.
Yeah, and you've talked openly about spending over $5,000 a month on childcare, which is more than your mortgage. Is that the video that went viral?
It is. That was the
Okay.
first one.
So, that number is staggering for most families, and I'm going to share mine after this, okay? But what does that kind of financial strain do to a household emotionally, professionally, and logistically? I know many of us can relate, but how would you kind of explain it to someone who's like, "Oh, come on, like it's just the price you pay for having a child." What is the real impact here?
Okay. So I think there's a couple of things and it's a layered conversation. First and foremost, childcare is rising faster than pretty much everything else. I think it's rising at 2x the rate of inflation. So when we think about how people are really upset about the cost of eggs, imagine that childcare has gone up even more than that, right? Families are seeing 5% to 20% increases every single year in how much they're paying for childcare. And that's like on a weekly rate, right? So it is rising incredibly fast. And so no matter how much you prepared, I had my first children in 2019. The cost is vastly different in 2025. And so there was no way for me to prepare for how expensive it would be today. No amount of planning was going to prepare me for a global pandemic and all of these things. And so I like to point that out because I think oftentimes people say, hey, you knew you were having a kid, you
Yeah.
knew
Oh,
childcare was expensive, but also it is rising faster than housing, than
yes.
groceries, all of the things that we are all very concerned about. I think everybody is concerned about this. And so, childcare in all 50 states is more expensive than rent for two children. It is more expensive, I think, for mortgages in 45 states. It's more expensive than in state college tuition. It is more expensive than the things that we typically think as our most expensive bill, essentially, at the end of the day. And so, I want people to kind of put that into perspective, which is we're hearing a lot about how people can't buy homes, people can't afford groceries. Well, people also cannot afford childcare. And there's a huge conversation going on about the falling birth rates. But if people cannot afford childcare, they cannot afford to have children. And so the math people are doing is okay, well, how many children can we have? What are the age gaps going to be? Maybe I can have two, but I have to wait till the oldest is in public school to be able to afford daycare for the younger one. I had a woman message me and say, we had twins and it was financially devastating. We
Yeah.
could not afford two children in childcare, especially not at infant rates, which are extremely high. And so families are saying we can't save for college because we're paying for childcare and childcare is more expensive than college, right? So all of these things are impacting families. They're not putting enough money away for retirement because they're paying for childcare. And so, it is not as simple as saying, you're a parent, this is your problem, you should deal with it. This has huge impact, not just on the individual family, but on our economy and society as a whole.
Yeah, and I mean the stress that it comes with, right? Like who is going to watch my child when I, have an issue? And you brought up the point about like it never really ends because even if a child is in school, even if a child is, past that age of needing like the full-time nanny or, preschool, when they get sick, a lot of us in America don't have
Mm,
PTO, don't have the ability to take the time off. So now you're taking your own vacation days or your own sick day to care for your own child. I mean, the whole system is multi-layered, right? And
totally.
sometimes then it becomes, and what I see is that we're sending children to school or preschool sick, right? Meaning because the parent can't take the time off. And then that becomes a issue with spreading germs. And it's like, I see this from a lot of my patients, right? Like that they're just struggling to even keep their kids in school. And then when there's like inconvenience, and it's such a sad reality that when our kids get sick or there's an issue with our children's health, that the first thing we think about is stress about like, well, not the kids' health. We think about the logistics of what am I going to do for work? And that is really upsetting. Like the lack of flexibility and the lack of being able to just do the normal parenting things that we have to do because of not having the accessible care for the child is emotionally draining. And then you think about the cost of like, how am I going to afford this? It's like
Hmm.
every layer. I talk so much about being a mindful parent and like not reacting to your children and responding. How are we going to be centered parents, grounded parents, when on our brain we're thinking about how am I going to afford this? Where is my paycheck coming from? Who's going to watch my kid if I get sick? Who's going to watch my kid if they get sick? Like all of that is just adding to the baggage that so many American parents are dealing with every day.
Mhm. Yeah, and they don't have enough, I think back to this past year, my youngest came home with a stomach bug, and if you're a parent, if one goes down, they
Oh,
won't go
yeah.
down alone. And it was this slow progression where, she was home for 3 days, and the day that she was able to go back to school, her sister got sick, and then she was home for 3 days, and then
It's like a
her
2-week
next sister
cycle.
got
Yeah.
sick. Yes, and then my
Oh,
husband got sick, and there's not enough PTO or sick time to cover that when you have 1, 2 children, and knowing that they get, what is it, on average, like 5 to 6 colds a year, there's not enough time. And people are at risk of losing jobs if they don't have sick time available to them. And so this is not just something that is as simple as even finding a flexible workplace, right? We don't have enough policy to support the needs of parents. And the majority of homes these days are dual income homes. They
yeah.
are. And so how do we support people in that situation where they're already struggling to pay the bills and then they have this added stress of, well, what will I do? My friend's daycare closed for 3 weeks because the sprinklers went off in the middle of the night. And it was a panic. It's like, what do we do? The building's not open. There is no childcare. I still have a job and my job does not care. And so, what do we do in that situation? How do we adjust? How do we accommodate this as workplaces, as a society, as families? It's incredibly difficult.
Yeah, and I'm about to share our childcare costs, which I think I've only shared once on like Moms First, I think is like an advocacy organization. I
Yes.
shared it there and people are like, what the heck? And I need to provide some context. I need everyone to just take a breath and like really center ourselves. I have 2 children. One of them is 5, one of them is almost 2 at the time of this recording. And we spend 7,800 a month on
Mm,
childcare for 2 children. Okay. And when the reason why I don't share that is that there's 2 things that come up. One is, well, you have the money. What a privilege.
mhm,
Like, why are you complaining? I'm not denying that I have the privilege of being able to afford $700, $800 in childcare. What I will say is that that is money that we can't have to save for a house. And we are
mhm,
struggling to buy a house in the community we live in right now because the housing market is so bad. So speaking to how this is not just about childcare, everything's expensive, right? So
mhm,
and so now it's becoming, well, okay, I need the flexibility of a nanny for my younger. My older is in a preschool that basically does you have to pay because it's not covered. It's not
right.
free. And so then that's what it is. And 7,800 is more than our rent because we rent right now. And it is a lot. And now, me and my husband at the time of this recording, we're thinking about moving. And I want to move to a place that has good public schools so that we do not have to think about private school. Because if we stay here, we're going to have to think about private school because South Florida does not have the best public school system. And so you're
Mm,
thinking about that. You're thinking about now I'm going to have to pay private school. And then now I have to think about 2 tuitions. And now I have to think about how this is never going to end. And I'm like, no, like I want the higher cost of living for better schools. And
mhm,
it's a big decision to make. And I am never going to deny the privilege that exists, right? What I'm dealing with is privilege, and I'm not going to deny that. But with it comes decision making of like, well, how are we going to afford the down payment of the house? When is this
mhm,
going to ease up a bit? And so that 7,800 is more than I get paid as a pediatrician, like a year, right? Like meaning I work as a reduced part time pediatrician. So basically, I can quit working and take care of my kids, but then I can't do the other passions, which is PedsDocTalk, all the travel that I have to do. So I need this setup, but I'm breaking even. Like I might as well just
mhm.
not work. And I know that is a problem with a lot of people. And you've spoken about this too, that it tends to be the woman who ends up deciding to leave the workforce if it is that, the cost isn't matching up. And I think you've seen that as well, right?
Yes, I mean, there's data to support this and
Yeah.
surveys to show that women are twice as likely to adjust their careers to accommodate for gaps in childcare. Not just the cost, but gaps. If you can't
Yeah.
find childcare, it's women who are taking time off. It's women who are leaving the workforce. And so it disproportionately impacts women. And we live also in a society that suggests that women should stay at home, right? But it also ignores the fact that the work, that you do as a pediatrician is incredibly valuable and important. And without you in the workforce, right? That leaves people lacking. And
Yes.
we cannot ignore that part of it. It's not as simple as just staying home. And also that ignores the impact on women, right? What happens is women, when they leave the workforce, even if just for a short period of time, let's say they just do it until their kid hits kindergarten, um, they miss out on career opportunities, on salary increases, they miss
Yeah.
out on retirement savings, they miss out on benefits, social security, and unfortunately, in our country, it is very difficult to re-enter the workforce after a long gap in your career. And depending on industry, you might need a license again, right? You might not be able to re-enter the workforce in the same career. And so women tend to find themselves starting from scratch. They're not able to re-enter where they were. It's as if everything they did before that is null and void. And so it puts women in this position where they are retiring later in life. They have
Yeah.
higher risk of financial insecurity. And so this is a problem that is often seen as a woman's issue because it disproportionately impacts women, but it is not, right? Men benefit just as much from childcare as women do. They need it just as much as we do. The economy needs it. And it's shown to be good ROI for businesses. When businesses
Yeah.
provide childcare or subsidize childcare for their employees or give them benefits, it is good for business. It is good for employee retention. And so we know that to be true. We just don't have the supports that we need for families. And I think also, you alluded to privilege, and I think it's really important to point out that yes, we sit in a place of privilege. I spend $70,000 a year on childcare right now. I sit in a
Yeah.
place of privilege to be able to do that. I also live in the state with the highest cost of childcare and some of the highest cost of living, but also the best education and the best healthcare and all the things, right? And so there's trade offs here. But I am in a privileged position to be able to pay for this. I have neighbors who are not making the same amount of money as I am, and they are unable to access childcare.
Yes.
That is important to acknowledge. They don't get a discounted rate. And even when there are vouchers available for families, they are encountering the exact same issues we are, which is there's a lack of space. There are not enough voucher spots for the children that need them. And so every single family and every single child is deserving of safe and affordable childcare. And so even though we sit in a place of privilege and we can afford it, it means there's so many families that can't. Right? There are so many families that are not accessing the childcare that they need to work the jobs that they have, whether it is shift work or whatever that might be. I think you probably know, working in a hospital, a lot of nurses struggle to find childcare
Yeah.
because they cannot find something that covers the 12-hour shift that they work. And so we have to think big picture about this. It is not an individual family issue. This is an issue we should all be thinking about.
Absolutely. And as you were talking, I was looking up a company, and I think there's a lot of companies that have been doing this, but there's this, I think you heard about the Cake's Body. Yeah,
Yeah.
you heard about them,
Yeah.
right? And so then
I
I
did.
remember seeing a video, and and that's why I was looking it up while you were talking about like them offering now what 30,000 a
I
year
think
or
it's
40,000,
36,000.
yeah,
Yeah, it's
a year towards childcare, which I'm just like, oh my god, like how emotional must that have been for a lot of the employees to be like, thank you for this gift of flexibility. And
mhm.
we are never going to deny, like my husband and I look back at when we had our son, when we had very limited childcare help. And I'm very vocal about explaining and showing value to my reality right now, because it wasn't always like this, right? I wasn't
Mhm.
always in this privileged state of being able to have this full-time nanny who is so flexible and Mary Poppins basically, and also have this access to a private, like a pre-K school for my son. But in the pandemic, when it was so hard to
Mm.
be a parent as it was because of isolation, we
Mhm.
lost our nanny, right? We had one. We lost our nanny at around 15, when my son was 15 months, who started when he was 4 months. He was in full-time or full-time daycare, getting sick every week, as we all knew, and especially in that pandemic, post-pandemic, when everything opened up,
Mm.
every week. And I had to cut back. And I made that decision with my husband because he was making the higher salary. And I was like, it makes sense for me to cut back, right? And I
Mhm.
also wanted to build PedsDocTalk. And it was hard for me. Like I didn't want to cut back because what you had said, I am valuable to have being a pediatrician. People needed a pediatrician during a pandemic, and yet I had to cut back. There was guilt. There was like, I'm going to be like, my patients won't have me. I got that from
Mhm.
patients. What are you doing with your other time? None of your business. Like it was, but it felt so
Right.
shameful of like, where are you? Like, why are you not working? I'm like, you don't even want to hear my circumstances right now. And it all worked out for our family. And right now we are so grateful because we do have peace. We have, our mental health is better. We're able to work out more because we have solid childcare. But
Mhm.
that is because it's right now a reality. We were so much more anxious. I went through depression, and all of that was a reality of not having a support system, right? Because so many Americans can't rely on grandma and grandpa because they're also aging and dealing with their own medical issues, or maybe they're just not able to be that childcare help. And that's, I think people often think like, well, utilize your family, utilize grandpa and grandma, but, or, why don't you just stay home? How do those narratives oversimplify the reality? And how do they perpetuate this sort of inequality, economic insecurity when we say like, oh, just use this or do this? It just seems dismissive, I feel.
It is dismissive, and here's the thing, a lot of people are using grandparents because they have
Yeah.
no other option. I know so many people who have grandparents who are helping. I mean, I think there's a very strong narrative online, especially that grandparents are not as involved as they used to be, but the data shows that a lot of grandparents are providing full-time childcare, and they are not, I say grandparents, but it is grandmothers mostly providing
Yes.
this childcare. And so I do wanna also speak to the fact that, again, this work disproportionately falls to women. So when we say grandparents, we typically mean grandma. And what we do in that situation that I do also think is somewhat harmful is we assume that family is inherently better for kids too, when in
Mhm.
reality, oftentimes being in a daycare setting or a preschool or a pre-K, even if it does cost money, is beneficial for children. It builds
Yeah.
um, social skills for my daughter who had a speech delay. Being in school helped her exponentially. It was
Same with our
amazing to
son.
see,
Mhm.
amazing. And we ignore all that. We ignore the fact that most daycare teachers have vast amounts of education in the field and they have a curriculum that they follow. And so all of these things can't be ignored as well, right? We oversimplify it and say they should stay with grandma, family is best, but sometimes actually being in a childcare center is best for a child. It is what they developmentally need. But also, to your point, it ignores the fact that a lot of grandparents are still working. We know that the retirement age keeps creeping up. They are still working. And a lot of people are having children later in life. So their parents are older. Maybe they're
Yeah.
not physically able to care for the grandchildren, or health wise, they are not able to care for them. Maybe they don't want to because they're in their retirement and they had dreams of traveling the world, whatever it might be. I think all of those things are valid. I don't think we should ever expect grandparents to provide unpaid childcare in a full-time capacity. I'm not saying they should never help us, but right, I think community is very important. We're also no longer typically living near our parents, right? A lot of
Yes.
people have moved and relocated and families are spread out and so they have to build a new village and figure out what that looks like. But there is a suggestion that we should be looking to family because that's what people have done historically. But also, I'm sure you can speak to this better than I can. The expectations on parents are higher these days, too, kind of what it looks like to be a quote unquote good parent and how involved and hands on you need to be at all times. And I think there's data that shows that working mothers today spend more time with their kids than stay at home moms did in the 70s, right? So we are also expected to be so much more involved, despite the fact we are also working full time and doing all of these things. And so, of course, burnout is happening. Of course,
Yeah.
burnout's happening. So I think it's not just one thing, right? It's an incredibly layered issue, and we ignore that fact often and just say, just stay home with the kids or just
Yeah.
have grandma. And it's just not that simple.
And it's again, there's so many layers to that. Like I always say, like you can only make the decisions based on your circumstances,
Of
right? And that
course.
problem is with the judgment out there is that many people who are judgmental just see that one moment or see that one scenario. They don't understand the big picture. And it's kind of like
Hmm.
why I am not judgmental is that I know that there's so many nuances, whether it's about childcare, screens, what are you feeding your kid?
Hmm.
I don't know what brought you to that moment. I have that big belief that like when we judge, we are judging a moment, we are judging only one side of the story. And it's not fair to them. It's not fair to any of us to make that assumption. And like, I love it because you said it perfectly. The aging, the fact that maybe there's grandparents that don't want to even do the childcare. I will speak honestly that my mom and dad are beautiful human beings and I love them. Like I love spending time with my mom, but she is not a good nanny or childcare person. And she's very clear because when she sees what my nanny does, who is like 7 years younger than my mom, and she's like, wow, like how does she have the energy to do that? I'm like, yeah, mom, you need your afternoon nap, which is literally when the kids wake up from their nap. And I'm like, you can't take an afternoon nap. Like
No.
literally, I'm having my mom help me. And all of a sudden she's going upstairs for her nap. I'm like, wait, the kids are up. Like I need you. So, and I get that they're older, they're in their 70s now. And they had that vision, like you said, of reality of doing their thing when they're older in their retirement. And so I have, for everyone listening, I have so many other podcasts about the grandparent parent dynamic and setting boundaries, but an important conversation because even when we look at now the government, right? The government says things like, oh, rely on this. And there's some interviews about, yeah, grandma, drop them off at grandma or grandpa's. You can't do that if grandpa is on dialysis. You can't do that
Mm-mm.
if grandma is not able to or wants to take care of the kids because she doesn't want to. I mean, I'm not
Mhm.
forcing my kids onto someone that doesn't want to take care of them. That is the worst thing we can do. I rather put them in a childcare where they're loved, nurtured with people who understand child development.
Yeah.
And don't get me started on like the differing parenting approaches, right? I mean, that's a whole other story.
Totally.
But
Totally.
that segue into the U.S., like there's this unspoken belief I think that comes down from not only, hire public officials on like policy about parents should figure it out, right? Like on
Mhm.
their own, right? Like, yeah, just throw them off to grandma's or whatever. Why do you think our country has failed to treat childcare as an essential infrastructure, like getting roads better, schools, other aspects? And what's the cost of that failure?
Yeah, I mean, the cost is huge. I think
Yeah.
it's a layered issue, and I think it often depends on what the current administration is, kind of what topic is coming to the forefront. I think a year ago, at the time of this recording, childcare was a big part of the conversation. Now you're not really hearing about childcare. They're not
Yeah.
talking about childcare. There's too many other things going on, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so I think that is part of the struggle, which is, I think, to your point of even just like varying ways of parenting between generations, there's also different expectations. There's this idea that you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We all did it. You can figure it out too. But we're living in a different reality. I think it's the same thing to your point of house hunting. I remember taking my parents to look at houses with me, and it was in a neighborhood they grew up in. And they were like, "No way. No way anybody should ever pay this amount of money for this house." And I was like, "This is on the cheap end, everyone.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
this is what homes cost. This is what we are dealing with." And I remember them being genuinely shocked
Yeah.
and saying, "I didn't realize how bad this was." And because they haven't had to do it in 30 plus years, right? And so they're not paying attention to the housing market. They're not buying a house. And I think the same thing is true of the childcare crisis. The average person who does not have a young child right now is not paying attention to the cost of childcare. And they
Yeah.
don't understand the ramifications on the workforce, on the economy, right? Our spending power decreases when we can't afford childcare, right? I can't buy anything else. I have to pay for daycare. And so I think it is something that we ignore because we can and because there's so many other things going on. I also think it is exacerbated, right? So I think we can't talk about one policy without the other. You could provide affordable childcare and we would still see struggles because there's still a lack of paid leave, right? And so
Yeah.
I think we need this holistic viewpoint on what it is that makes parenting possible in the US, what it looks like to build um infrastructure around families and children. It is so incredibly important to be doing that and to think through all of the layers to this conversation. What can organizations be doing? What can policy be doing? What can we be doing within our communities? All of these things matter. And so, yeah, I mean, the cost, it's hard to put a cost on it, but it is a market failure, right? This is something that economists point to as a huge market failure. We need this. This is infrastructure. This is not a want. This is a need for
Yeah.
our society. And so I think it is something that, unfortunately, I don't know if right now in this current administration is going to be something that we'll see happen for families. But I say that. I don't want people to feel like there's no hope. I think there
Yeah.
are things we can do in our companies. There's things we can do in our communities, in our states, maybe federally it's not happening right now, but statewide, right? There are states that are doing things. There are towns that are doing things to implement change in specific ways. And so I think there is definitely still hope for what it could look like. But obviously, the dream, the goal is for every family in our country to have access to affordable childcare, paid leave, so they can take adequate time off with their children. And the benefits would be huge.
Absolutely. I mean, we didn't get into the economic ramifications of how amazing this could be. I mean, it would be phenomenal, right? We would have women also be able to stay in the workplace, not have to cut back if they don't want to. I mean, some do, and that's
Exactly.
fine. But all of that would be good. And it seems like such common sense. Like it seems like for a country that values capitalism so much, you would
Yes.
want people to stay in a capitalistic world, and yet you're pulling
Hmm.
people out of it. Like I'm like, you're the country of capitalism. Like why
I
are
know.
we? This would benefit capitalism like to have more people in the workforce than staying home, right? And it would give it just it boggles my mind, and it really is a stressful point of contention for me, because I'm like, just I want people to have the resources, and I know how valuable this is to parental approach to their mental health and their parenting, right? This is not like when I'm very big, as you know, if you follow me, that I talk about parenting, I talk about how to handle tantrums, picky eating, but if parents are stressed about every aspect in their life, including how are they going to afford food, who's going to take care of the kids, they can't focus on being a regulated parent for their child and approach tantrums in a nice, calm, grounded way. And it's cyclical. I mean, you can't do that. And it's just an obvious thing for me, and why I care so much about policy and advocacy on top of all this, because I know that it's a holistic approach to this. And You know,
Mhm.
you've talked so much about this, obviously, with that first video that went viral, all the things that you continue to do, not just about administration policy, but just in general. What's been the most eye-opening response you've received from other parents since you started speaking out? And is there a common thread of frustration or fear you keep hearing, or what is that common sentiment?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where, parents are caught very by surprise by the high cost, right? I think we were talking about how people who don't have young kids are not thinking about the cost of childcare. Even couples who are trying to conceive, oftentimes they're really focused on the trying to conceive part, and they haven't done adequate planning for what childcare costs will look like.
Yeah,
And they have a lack of information. I think that's a big part of what's going on too. In the same way we don't have salary transparency, we don't really have transparency when it comes to the cost of childcare. I think it's changing. We're getting more resources here. And if you know where to look, you can find it. But most people don't know where to look. You don't know that you can go to your government website and find every childcare center and their rates, because why would you know that, right? Who's
right,
doing
right.
that? And so, if you call a daycare and you ask for the rates, typically they make you come for a tour, and they don't give you the rates unless you come for a tour. And so it's very difficult to plan, and you can't anticipate what the increases are going to be. So what I find from a lot of parents is that they struggle to keep up, because when they enroll their child as an infant, they're promised that the rate decreases when they're a toddler or in preschool. But then it decreases, but the increase comes for the annual rate, and they're back paying the same thing they were paying before. And so when they budgeted, they weren't able to really actually account for what it was going to look like, because you don't know.
Yeah,
And I think the same thing is true about older kids. We talked about this briefly at the beginning, but I think one of the overwhelming things I hear from women in particular is that they were unprepared for how difficult it is to navigate kids who are in public school, because the public school calendar does not align with workplace expectations and hours. And so they find themselves juggling before school care, after school
yeah,
care, summer camp. All of these things are incredibly competitive to get into. So you're signing on at midnight and trying to register them.
yeah,
Incredibly expensive. I mean, summer camp makes you pay typically upfront in full. So you might
yeah.
be paying 10K at one time for summer camp. Um, and there's so many half days, no school days, school break weeks, all things that parents aren't sure how to account for. And so they're trying to mix together winter break camp and a nanny who's available on a random Tuesday and all of these things. And oftentimes I'm hearing from parents that they're leaving the workforce not when their kids are 2, but when their kids 10, because
Yeah.
it's much harder the older that they get to navigate these things. They're finding it much more difficult to piece together. And so that has been the most surprising thing to me, because I'm very early in that. Now, at this point, my kids have been in public school for 3 years. But when I first started sharing, I was caught very by surprise by that part, which was I didn't leave the workforce when my kid entered daycare. I left the workforce when my kid turned 6, because
Mm,
I could not keep up. And I think we're ignoring that part of the conversation a lot. We're focusing a lot on those early years of parenting, and parents who are in kind of those middle years before middle school and high school are struggling. They are really struggling, and they don't have adequate resources. There's often not things like vouchers for summer camp. And so they're not really sure what to do or how to handle it. And so that caught me very by surprise and was an overwhelming response that I received.
well, you are now catching me by surprise. So no, I mean, I talked to my husband about this. I'm like, because we have obviously friends that have older children, and I'm like, look, it gets busier with all the again, like the activities too. I mean, right now they're with me. I don't need to put my 2-year-old in like all these different classes. Like all they care about is, mommy, we're going to start her in preschool. But like, yeah, they don't need a lot. Like it's
No.
just us and that. But now it's the peer relationships. It's the soccer camps. It's trying also, like, we go back to that perfectionism. Like me and him, my husband, are very big on like, what is it that we really need to do so that we are not overstretching ourselves also financially with the cost of all these activities, and then
Hmm.
also, like you said, with the time that we have, and making sure that we're allowing for some idle time for that child, right? So from a developmental parenting perspective, it's enriching experiences. I need someone to be taking care of my kid while I finish up by 5 p.m. to be able to go pick
Hmm.
them up, but I also don't want to overschedule my kid and be busy every weekend with like 7 soccer games, and that kid doesn't even have time to just sit and be a kid, if you will. But
Yeah.
so many layers of all this, again, perfectionism, but also just wanting to provide our children with experiences, and also so that we can work. Like I get that. Like these right now, my son's pickup is at 2:30
Oof.
without aftercare.
Yeah.
I'm like, and starts at 8, okay, which is whatever. But I'm like, can we get like a 3:30, a 4? Like it'll be so much easier. But at 2:30, I don't even get done with my meetings by then. So I'm hustling, bringing him back, and then trying to figure out what can we do with independent play, what can he do, and for like that he's not getting bored. And then we do educational apps on the iPad now because he's getting out at 2:30, and I don't feel guilty or anything because it's a blend, right? He had school and now he's going to do this, but it's just a harder narrative of like, okay, who's going to pick up the kids? I have to now break the meeting, make sure I'm done for the meeting to go pick him up and get him back.
Mhm.
He needs a snack. He can get his own snack, but then I also want to make sure that he's making good choices with his snack and all this stuff. Layers.
So many
Yeah,
layers, and you alluded to it, but also I think people don't understand that, yeah, with preschool typically, there's no after school care.
yeah.
You have to figure that out on your own, and, in a lot of places, the town next door to me, they still don't have free full day kindergarten. They have to pay if they wanna go to
Mm,
full day kindergarten, so they get half day, but most people I know are working at
yeah.
noon, when half day ends, and so
Wow.
these
Yeah.
are things that families are struggling with. Do we pay for kindergarten, or do we figure out what to do at noon every single day?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't even want to think about that. Yeah, because we were like, yeah, and noon seems like, I mean, an early pickup when that's like at 11 o'clock early, that's the half day. And I'm like, what did I just do? Like, I dropped you off
Nothing.
and I turned back around. Like, literally,
Yeah.
I sat and checked one email and then now I'm like, okay, pickup time. Oh,
Yes.
this is so great. Now, for families who feel stuck, like they're choosing
Mhm.
between paycheck, reliable childcare, what would you want them to know? And what message do you have for the parent that's feeling like they're just failing at all this, that they are trying to make ends meet? What do we even do? What are some sort of like tangible tips or reassurance or things to think about for these families?
Well, first and foremost, I tell everyone, you're not failing. The systems
Yeah.
are failing, right? Nobody was
Yes.
set up for success in this situation. Even in the most privileged position that you and I are acknowledging here, I'm stressed out about these things. I'm thinking about them constantly. I'm constantly navigating what childcare looks like for our family and budgeting accordingly and adjusting my career according to the needs of my family. And so you are not failing. The system is failing. If the most privileged people are stressed out,
Yeah.
that is telling you something about the realities of what childcare looks like in our country. And so you are not failing. I think that's incredibly important. As you've mentioned, sometimes parenting can feel incredibly isolating. And in a society where we are told these are your children, figure it out, it can feel very difficult with that narrative of you need to afford kids before you have them, all of these things, right? It feels impossible. And so I just want to take that off of everyone's shoulders that you are not failing. The systems are failing. Now, what can we do? I mean, this can
Yes.
feel
Love that.
difficult. This
Yeah.
can feel really hard. This can feel insurmountable at times. But I do think, number one, bringing awareness to this. I think even you sharing your cost of childcare with Moms First, that matters. Bringing awareness to these things absolutely matters. Getting loud about these things matters because the more attention we bring to it and more awareness, the more we can address it, right? If we stay quiet about this, then nobody realizes, nobody cares, nobody pays attention. And so unfortunately, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Be squeaky about it. Talk about it. Educate your friends about it too, right? I think that's something we can do more of. Um, I highly recommend getting involved on a local level if you can, right? So you mentioned Moms First. Moms First does a lot of different efforts and advocacy around the cost of childcare. There are also organizations like Chamber of Mothers. Chamber of Mothers also has local efforts. So there might be a chapter in your area depending on where you live. And so they're doing local level efforts to advance these things. There's an organization called Mother Forward. Moms Rising. There are so many
Yeah.
different organizations, and you're hearing the word mom a lot. And again, that's mostly because this disproportionately impacts moms. And so moms are thinking about this and working towards change. Be aware of policies. Call your representatives, do those things. But I encourage you to think local as much as you possibly can. So, do you work at a workplace where you believe that if you brought them an encouraging case about what it would look like, the ROI on providing backup care or a stipend or whatever that might be for childcare. Bring it to your workplace. I know that sounds not helpful to everyone because it's not, but it is something we can do. And I actually think the more workplaces that implement policies like cakes,
Yeah.
the more that we see that in workplaces, the more that policy will follow. Because if organizations that drive capitalism are investing in this, they will eventually put pressure on politicians to invest in it too
Yeah.
because what's good for them is good for that each other, right? So they're constantly working together, and so the more that we put this pressure on our workplaces, the more that we can also see change federally if possible. And so I definitely encourage that. I think also I think we have to, unfortunately, day to day, like in our real lives, get creative as much as we possibly can and A big piece that we don't often talk about is partnership here. What are you
Yeah.
doing with your partner? This should never be falling squarely on mom's shoulders. It should not be mom's responsibility to take every sick day, to figure out childcare, to bridge every single gap. That leads to burnout, resentment, frustration, mental health issues, physical health issues, exhaustion. It is something that both parents should be equally involved in. And I think that is more and more the case, but still, this disproportionately impacts moms. And so, when you're thinking about what this looks like logistically, please do not compare your salary to the cost of childcare. This is a shared family expense, and it should be seen as such. It should be, part of the equation, that it is not just yours to carry alone, and neither are the gaps. And so, I highly encourage people within their relationships to have conversations about what it looks like to navigate this together, where one person does not feel the burden more than the other.
Oh, we dealt with that resentment, when I told you that my son was getting sick a lot and I had to be the
Mm,
one. And at that point, I'm gonna be quite transparent. People really needed an ER doctor a lot during a pandemic.
of
So so
course.
so let's be clear that it made sense for me to be the one to be able to call out, but it did obviously add a lot of stress. And as we navigated things, one of the biggest things that we did, so obviously my husband and I are both physicians, we did call schedules. So we would create a call schedules, including for overnight illnesses. So like if one of the kids sick and we both have to do something the next day, who needs sleep more? And it was
Mhm.
very equalized because some days my husband wouldn't work till 3 in the afternoon, so he could take the overnight, right?
Mhm.
Some days I'm up at 8 because I had to be at the office, and that's going to be more exhausting for me. And then we did that during the day as well. When if my husband was off that day, I didn't have to think about it. But then if he was working, that it was clear that I would be the one because him taking that time off would be more of a financial hit than me taking the time off. Because if he takes time off, he doesn't get paid. There's no sick
Right.
days when you're an independent contractor as a physician, you don't get time off. It's literally if you don't work, you don't get paid. So
Mm.
for me, I did have the sick day. So I love that communication aspect, like you said, using your partner as hopefully if you do have one, using that communication to really make it work for both of you because you do not want that resentment to creep
No.
in. I completely understand. And you already talked about a little bit of this, but if you had a magic wand and you could implement three immediate changes to address the childcare crisis in America, even if it's at a more national level,
Mhm.
what would they be? And how do you think they can transform the lives of families like yourself, mine, and all of our families in America who are struggling with this?
Sure. So I think the three things I would think about would be one, paid parental leave. And when I say that, I don't just mean for moms, I mean for dads
Yes, yes,
too. And I
yes.
would want it to be adequate, right? We can look to peer nations that are doing this in a really meaningful way. I think that would be huge. And so that would be one thing. And I would also like, if it comes from our workplaces, mandated. Right. In countries where it's mandated for men and women to do it together or to have, adequate time, it makes a huge difference, not
Yeah.
just in the child's life, but in the parents' lives, in the community. So I think that's really important. Obviously, affordable childcare. Now, when I say that, I want to be very clear that I believe that we should have government funded and subsidized childcare. I think we also need to really change the childcare industry. It is privatized in a lot of ways. We have private equity in childcare. Childcare workers are not paid fairly. They are paid very poorly for the job that they're doing, which is why it is so difficult for childcare centers to remain open and to staff appropriately. That is a concern. It's the same thing with teaching, right? We have
Yes.
teachers leaving the workforce. They are not adequately paid for the work that they're doing. And so that is incredibly important. When we think about reform here, we cannot just think about reform for families. We have to think about reform for the people who are working within the industry, which is also disproportionately in women. So I would want government funded and subsidized childcare that also accounts for the pay for the
Yeah.
child workers. And then workplaces, we need workplace flexibility. We need to reimagine what it looks like to be a salaried employee. We need to reimagine what flexibility looks like. We need to, in my strong belief, do away with full time return to office mandates when they are not required. Obviously, your job cannot be done remotely in all instances. My husband is a first responder. His job cannot be done remotely. But there are so many things we can do across many different industries to account for the needs of families and what flexibility looks like. And so, if there's a day that is federally a holiday for every single school, there is no reason parents should be expected to go to the office that day. Like,
Right,
it just
right.
doesn't make sense. So, really adjusting what our workplace expectations look like with what our childcare solutions look like, right? How do we make that work together? And so,
Yeah.
those are three things off the top of my head. Obviously, there's so many more, but the impact would just be immense.
Absolutely. And I mean, I love that you tackled obviously federal, the childcare, the workplace, and exactly what you had mentioned before about how there's different levels that we can do this at. And like you said, I don't think it's going to happen in the next 4 years of like any changes, but being vocal is really important. I loved getting to connect with you, not only just finding your face all over my Yahoo and everywhere. I'm like, who is this girl? And then I finally met you, and I was like, I know you. And connecting with you, Paige, just being able to hear your advocacy, and also everyone should follow her. I'm going to be linking her information in my show notes, but not just about paid leave, but about the mental load, about men and women in relationships. You sometimes share other posts that make jokes about the labor that we each have, and I just think it's, again, important to have these conversations for the awareness to be there, and then thus the advocacy can happen as well. And thank you so much for giving those advocacy organizations. I know them very well too, and I'll be linking those as well on our show notes. What would be the final uplifting message for everyone listening in today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing to know is that I think as a group of parents, we're all in the fight together. Like, I think more now than ever, parents seem really united on this
Yeah.
topic in particular, around childcare in particular. And so I think that's hopeful, right? I think if so many people care about this issue, I actually do think we can see change. So I think that is hopeful. I think the fact that we are hearing more about this, we are seeing more about this, you are reading it in Business Insider, that is hopeful. I don't know that we would have seen that 5 years ago. And so I do think that we will see change here. It might take a long time, but I do think the more that we continue to talk about it and bring awareness to it, that maybe not for our kids and our daycare rates, but those who come behind us.
Yes, and I love that pay the positive pay it forward. Sometimes, like, I'm in healthcare, which is actually a very, I don't think people realize how toxic healthcare is. There's a mentality that if I struggle, you struggle, and it's very toxic, like especially within women and mothers. But like I said, like, I didn't get paid leave in my job. It was actually horrible. I approached them, talking to them about, again, like, hey, this is why we need paid leave. Like, I was really sick, and I had to work with them, but it wasn't paid. It was, obviously we took a huge pay cut with the medical bills that we had. But yeah, starting these conversations, even if it didn't happen for us, it can happen for our children. It can happen for
Hmm.
their peers if we choose to not, if they don't decide to have children, our children's children. But it's an important conversation that I hope I can see in my lifetime. And I believe that we will. I believe that we will see changes. And I love that we're seeing that on the state level. A lot of the reason why we're thinking about relocating from where we currently are, and by the time this airs, we might have been relocated for anyone tuning in, is that sort of, emphasis on families, emphasis on affordable childcare, paid leave, whatever we can do so that my kids are growing up in an environment that knows that this state or this community values families as much as we can. And
Hmm.
I will never understand how maybe I can, but how we can't understand that by supporting this, it's better for the economy. There's so much data that proves this, but also just it's going to mean more people in the workforce, and it's
Hmm.
happier people in the workforce, which means better productivity. Like, how do you not understand that? Like, you're going to
Yes.
have stressed, disgruntled mothers and fathers because they're trying to figure out how to afford to pay for their kids' care. And that just doesn't mean good productivity. And I'm grateful to have a business that has 4 employees right now who basically have the flexible schedules they want, meaning they all work virtually. If they want to take time to go to their kids' holiday event, or take the weekend off, that's the policy. I have no vacation policy. I have no sick day policy because I didn't get that. I was in a healthcare system that was like, you got to do this, you got to show up. And these are all NPs and PAs that are now getting that freedom. And it's my small way. I can't afford to give the $36,000 childcare credit, but if I can, that is next on my list,
I love
because
it.
that would be. I mean, that's how we do it, right? And thank you for joining me. Where can people go to stay connected? That is important to me too. Yeah.
Sure. So you can find me pretty much on all social media platforms at She is a Page Turner, but I have a website, she'isapageturner.com, and I'm on LinkedIn too, which is a sneaky place where I share a lot of this stuff. So if you're on LinkedIn, you can find me at Paige Connell.
Thank you. Well, it was such a pleasure finally chatting with you on the show and also meeting you. I don't have a lot of my guests that I've met in real life, so that I feel like is a privilege to be able to do that. And thank you so much for coming on today and having this amazing, important conversation that I think that needs to keep happening over and over. So thank you.
Thank you.
And for everyone tuning in, I'm sure you love this episode. And it's really important that we share conversations like this that me and Paige have talked about, right? In order to start this conversation, continue it, and get the changes we need, you have to share it. So please share this episode wherever you can. Send it to a friend, send it to your mom who's not understanding why you're complaining about childcare costs. Send it to whoever so that we can continue these conversations and advocate for true change. And I cannot wait to chat with another guest next time on the show.